Hello everyone and welcome to today's Cambridge University Press ELT webinar. I'm very pleased to welcome as today's presenter, Craig Thaine. Co-author of Cambridge English in Power, Craig has been involved in ELT for 30 years. He is Cambridge DT EFLA qualified and also has an MA Honours in Applied Linguistics. He's worked as a teacher and teacher trainer in many different countries, including England, Italy, Egypt, Sweden, and New Zealand. He's currently Director of Teacher Training at Languages International Auckland and is a Cambridge English Language Assessment Teaching Awards Assessor for both the CELTA and Delta schemes. So, over to you, Craig.
Thank you, Alistair. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and Happy New Year, and welcome to the very first Cambridge English webinar for 2016. This evening, I'm saying this evening because I'm speaking to you from Auckland, and it's 10 o'clock in the evening. I've noticed that there is at least one other person, Liliane, from Auckland, so thank you, Liliane, for joining from the same town that I'm speaking from, the same city that I'm speaking from. So yes, good evening, but good morning, good afternoon to the rest of you in different parts of the world. I appreciate that this webinar is at a slightly different time, and if you're joining early, thank you very much for getting up and doing that. So today we're going to be looking at learner motivation, and some of you saw this slide as you were waiting for the webinar to begin, and you've typed your answers into the chat box already, and I have to say that your answers are quite typical of answers that I've heard teachers give at different professional development sessions over the years. So thank you for your contributions. These are some other possible answers. I think some of them are very, very similar to what you have written, what you have indicated in the chat box, but maybe there are one or two other ones there which perhaps you wouldn't contribute to a webinar or want to write into a chat box. But I think that sometimes teachers, do things because they feel that they have to. So that is a reality, and it's the same with our learners. That sometimes they're well motivated, but sometimes they're in our classes because they feel they have to be, rather than because they want to be. And of course, for us, that can sometimes create a little bit of a problem. So what I'd like to do in these webinar this evening is I want to look at different kinds of learner motivation. I'd like to look at the history of how motivation has been discussed in reference to English language teaching. Then I'd like to explore different ways that we as teachers can think about motivation, and then I'd like to show some practical suggestions of how we can help our learners. In providing these ideas, I'm not saying that I have got all the answers. I haven't. The aim of the session tonight is to share some ideas with you. Some of them will work for your context, others will not. But what I've tried to do is approach and think about different ways of conceiving motivation, because sometimes it's not the materials, sometimes it's not the learners. Often we have to look at different aspects of what's going on in our English language classrooms. So that's what I really want to do, is explore some different points of view, some different ways of looking at motivation, in the hope that something will be useful for you, maybe if it's not all useful. So let's first of all think about what motivates our learners. So just for a minute or two, would you like to write into your chat box what you think motivates some of your learners? There'll be different answers, clearly, so let's just share some ideas together. Exams? Good. A smile, exactly. It helps if a teacher is smiling when learners walk into the classroom. Good. Fun activities, interesting lessons, wanting to please the teacher. Okay, the teacher's personality. Okay, extrinsic motivation, so think factors outside the learners, games, humor, positive feedback. Great, that's a fantastic list, and we'll be touching on many of those things in the webinar as we work through the slides. So here are some more possible answers that I've heard over the years. Learners have expressed these maybe not in exactly this language, but indicating that that is why they want to study English. Maybe not in exactly those words. And there's a whole raft of things, from things like, just liking the sound of English, to one where it says, all my best friends study English and this is the coolest school. That was actually said to me. It was actually not said to me in English, it was said to me in Italian. But that was the learner's motivation for attending a school that I worked for in Rome for a while. And then one of the people who contributed to the chat mentioned this idea that often there's external motivation, that parents are forcing learners to do course. So in effect, learners come to our classroom with a whole raft of motivations, and if you've got 25 learners, possibly there are 25 different motivations for learning English, and obviously that can be tricky for us to manage sometimes. So what I'd like to start with in terms of exploring motivation is just to look at some background, a little bit of history in terms of how motivation has been talked about and conceived in terms of second language learning. So we go back to the very end of the 1950s, virtually 1960, and this really was when motivation in terms of language learning, second language learning, began to be discussed. And the person who looked at this was a man called Robert Gardner. His name's there in the final bullet point. And he was a social psychologist, and he looked at two ways in which people were motivated to learn a second language. The first is integrative motivation, and this means that for some reason a learner wants to integrate to some degree with a second language community. Now, that does not necessarily mean that they are refugees or immigrants to a country. It could be someone living in another country, but they just like the culture of that language and they want to identify with the culture of that language in some way and feel that they're a part of that culture and that culture is a part of them as well. So integration does not necessarily mean going to live in the target language community. Instrumental motivation, so this is when learners have a very specific reason for learning English. So for example, they want to get a better job, or perhaps they want to do some kind of tertiary study in English. So when I was studying, when I first started studying it on my diploma, this largely was the way that we talked about motivation: integrative motivation or instrumental motivation. Then in the 1990s, Zoltan Dornier began to explore motivation in a variety of different ways. I have to say that if you are interested in the topic of motivation, Zoltan Dornier's books are fantastic. He really is the expert in terms of looking at learner motivation, and I can't recommend his material highly enough. And I've drawn quite a lot from his material in terms of preparing this webinar. So he talks about a cognitive situated period. So in cognitive, what he was concerned with or interested in was the ways in which learners think about motivation, and in particular the ways in which they decide why they've been successful. So if they've passed an exam and they feel as though they've been successful, this obviously, they're going to look at the exam as a kind of an indicator, a milestone in their language learning, and thinking, okay, I've achieved that, and that will motivate them. Or it could be to do with a course. They might think that course was not very good, that's why I actually haven't made progress in my language. Or it could indeed be a teacher. But basically, cognitive is to do with what the learner is thinking about why they are motivated and what reasons that they give to themselves about why they're motivated. The other point that he highlighted, and this is the situated part of cognitive situated, are the actual specific factors that play a role. So, okay, the course and the teacher, but also the physical learning environment, because, clearly learners don't learn as well if they're in an airless, hot room and they feel as though they're not getting enough oxygen. So, all of these things to do with the situation can also play a role. So what Zoltán Thaine was doing here was he was kind of enlarging the ideas that can contribute to learner motivation when they're learning a second language. Okay, then he has taken his ideas a little bit further, and in the noughties, in other words from 2000 until 2010, and really up until very, very recently, he's focused on these ideas. He's talked about process-orientated dynamic approach. So basically what he's saying is that motivation is not something that always stays the same. So it's almost like a process, and it's changing all the time. And that, I have to say, makes a lot of sense to me. And then more recently, he's been looking at the L2, the second language motivational self system. So I just want to tease that idea out a little bit. So if we look at these points here, what he does is he talks about two different kinds of self. So he talks about the ideal self, so the kind of second language learner that we would like to become. So for example, if I don't speak any Russian whatsoever, but imagine that I did want to learn Russian, and I might have this kind of dream of myself being able to read Dostoevsky in Russian and actually go to Russia and sit in a cafe and have an intellectual conversation about one of Dostoevsky's novels. Now, given that I know no Russian whatsoever, or virtually no Russian whatsoever, at the moment that's a kind of a dream. But something like that, this kind of ideal self, the ideal Russian speaker that I would like to be, can actually be a powerful motivational force for me and kind of keep me motivated when times are tough, when I'm having to learn a lot of difficult Russian grammar. Then he also talks about the ought to self, and I think that this is quite interesting, and this is the kind of second language learner that people think they should become. But often this can be related to what other people want them to do. So this comes back to the point that's been discussed already, and that is that in effect often our learners are in our classrooms because parents, or maybe their boss or someone like that, has told them that they need to learn English. So yeah, that is the ought to self. So the ideal self and the ought to self, which is related to someone perhaps forcing or putting a little bit of pressure on the learner, and that's why they have to learn English and why they're in the classroom. And then again, with this idea of the motivational self, once again, Thaine he emphasized yet again the situation-specific motivation that is connected to the learning context. So again, things like the teacher, the course, the actual physical learning environment. It's not really a problem, but when you begin to read about motivation in this way, one of the things that occurred to me is looking at it from a historical perspective. You are perhaps in danger sometimes of going through a process of thinking, oh well, instrumental motivation, well that was the 1970s and the 1980s, and is that really sort of important anymore? And what's important now is the motivational self. And I think that what is interesting to do is actually to try and pull a lot of that historical information together. So when I was thinking about motivation and thinking about the seminar and how motivation makes sense to me as a teacher and how I can sort of pull all these historical strands together, I came up with these ideas. So I looked at the idea that there could be motivation which is associated with the curriculum. There could be motivation that relates to the learner as an individual. And then also I thought you could look at motivation from the point of view of what's actually happening during the course of a lesson. And so this was my way of kind of grouping some of these historical ideas together. And obviously what underpins all this is the fact that motivation, I think, is a dynamic process. It's something that changes over time. So, for example, at my school, we offer, here in New Zealand, not the school I own, the school I work for, learners will perhaps enroll for a 6-month period. And when they start at the school, they're very, very motivated, they're really keen, and they make progress over the first 2 or 3 months, and then they might actually go through a period where they feel as though they're not actually moving forward very much, and their motivation will dip down. And then perhaps they might do an exam, and the exam might actually motivate them because it gives them a specific motivational goal. So they might enroll for something like Cambridge First, or perhaps do an IELTS course or something like that. So we see that their motivation going up and down over the period of time that they are at the school. But I think also that that process can go on during the course of an individual lesson. So this is how I kind of, looking at these 3 different categories, this is how I kind of pulled them together, and this is where I thought some of those historical perspectives could fit. So if I'm looking at individual motivation, I would see that integrative and instrumental needs would be part of that. I also think that that would include things like confidence and anxiety. Sometimes learners, when they come to our classes, are extremely anxious because they feel like children. They might feel ridiculous when they're having to speak in a second language. I think that individual motivation will also include some attitudes, how learners feel about a second language or second language community. And I think that individual motivation also incorporates the idea of motivational selves that we talked about, your ideal self and your ought to self. Then the second category that I had, curriculum motivation, what I felt that this included were the learning materials and resources that we use as teachers in the classroom. It will also include the methodology that we use. So, for example, we often get learners at our school from countries like China or Korea, where the methodology that they've had in high schools is perhaps quite different from a more communicative methodology that they encounter when they come to our school. So this can affect their motivation, and not necessarily, sometimes in a positive way, sometimes in a negative way, and often we as teachers need to be aware of that and perhaps make some adjustments. Assessment can also affect motivation, obviously. Assessment's interesting because I think that it can be both positive and negative. So assessment in the form of an exam can provide a motivational goal for learners, but sometimes assessment and tests can be seen as intimidating by learners and can also have a negative effect on their motivation. So I think that assessment can be both positive and negative in terms of learner motivation. The teacher, the kind of person that we are, the way in which we relate to our learners, the way that we behave. Someone in the chat mentioned the fact that a smile can help motivation. And I think that, if we do smile and are perceived as being friendly, welcoming human beings, that can help enormously. But also the learning environment, obviously. In an ideal world, I know it's not always possible, but we would like our learners to be in a comfortable physical environment when they're in the classroom. But sometimes we as teachers don't have a lot of control over that. Okay, and then finally, my third category, real-time motivation. So here I felt that this included what was going on as a lesson unfolds. the moment in which we're actually delivering the lesson. So this would include the kinds of tasks and activities that we're giving to learners during the course of the lesson. So people have, quite a few people at the beginning mentioned games as being powerful motivators for learners. So obviously, if you've done a kind of a heavy-duty grammar lesson, you can perhaps increase learners' motivation by giving them a communicative game, and that can help enormously. Our behaviours, what we do in the lesson, that's obviously going to affect, and also our teaching skills. So just to take one example, a teacher at my school is extremely skilled at drilling and focusing on pronunciation. And when she drills, she does it with such finesse and expertise and energy, it really motivates her students, and they love it. So individual teaching skills of this nature, the things that we do in terms of giving instructions, checking meaning, drilling, focusing on form, what we do at the whiteboard, how we use computers in the classroom, all of these things can have an effect on motivation, and they will affect what's happening for the learners during the course of a lesson. So I've got a task, and in many ways it's more of a test of my categories than it is of your thinking. So what I've done is, in the thought cloud, I've made some comments that learners might be thinking. Now, in reality, they might be thinking these things in their first language. And what I would like you to do is to see which of the categories does this seem to match for you. So, for example, here, how can I understand listening at 7 o'clock on a Friday night? I think that probably is in part curriculum, to do with curriculum, and in part to do with real time, what's actually happening in the lesson. The easiest way of perhaps doing this is I will show you there are 8 clouds, thought clouds, and it might be easier if you write the numbers on a piece of paper and then just maybe write I for individual, C for curriculum, R for real time beside each number. And then after I've shown you all the thought clouds, there is a slide where I've got all those sentences together. The aim here really is not to be right or wrong with this task. The aim really is just to see how these categories work for you and whether they're useful. And if they don't, you might find that the categories suggest something else for you. And that really is the aim, is to get you thinking about motivation as being maybe 3 or 4 different things, different categories. And if my categories don't work for you, I hope that you can find categories that are your own categories and work well for you. But the key thing is just thinking about motivation. And the reason to do this, to think about motivation in this way, is if there is a motivation problem with our learners, then we need to first of all determine what it might be. So that's number 1. We've looked at number 1. So here is thought cloud number 2. So a learner might be thinking, I want to be able to understand Taylor Swift's lyrics. So the learner might be a fan of Taylor Swift, and he or she wants to understand their lyrics, the words of the songs, and that's the learner's motivation for studying English. Okay, number 3. I can't stand it when he goes on about pronunciation all the time. Now the he here obviously is the teacher. So here a learner is in the lesson and they are doing some kind of pronunciation activity and the learner is frustrated. So is that individual, curriculum, or real time? Number 4, I did badly in the test because we didn't have enough time to study all the material. So here the learner is saying that the course was the reason that they weren't successful in the test. So which of those 3 would you say that is? Number 5, here the learner again is in a lesson and saying, I don't understand what I have to do with this task. So clearly this learner is experiencing some degree of frustration, okay, because they don't know what they need to do. Here in number 6, the learner is thinking, I know I'd learn this better online. So basically they're perhaps in a lesson and they feel as though they're struggling to understand, but they perhaps feel that if they're at their computer and working with this language and this material, they would be more successful. Number 7, the learner perhaps, this is not necessarily in a lesson, but the learner's reflecting on an English language course that they've done, and they're thinking, I can see I'll handle overseas holidays better in the future. So their reason perhaps for enrolling in a course is because they want to travel. And the last one is, I don't like working in pairs with him. So again, the learner is in the lesson and yeah, they feel unhappy with their partner, which I know happens quite often. So here are all the 8 thoughts together, and I can see you've been quite busy putting them in. Great. And there are different, obviously you're coming up with different answers, and that is actually quite normal. When I've done this with groups of teachers, I have found that, you know, people have different perspectives on these. So these are what I thought. You may not agree, and that's okay. That's absolutely fine. As I said, the key issue here is not to be right or wrong, but to see if these categories maybe work for you, and if they don't, hopefully they will suggest other categories. But what I think is the general principle here is that when we are thinking about motivation, we need to make sure that we look at why learners are actually experiencing problems. And if we've got some category, some kind of framework, then we can perhaps begin to solve the problem because we've been able to identify it. This is a quote from Zoltan Dornier, which I particularly like. What he says, that I think that most students' motivation can be worked on and increased. Although rewards and punishments are too often the only tools present in the motivational arsenal of many teachers, the spectrum of other and potentially more effective motivational strategies is so broad. And this is something I agree with quite strongly. It comes back to this idea of his, the fact that motivation is dynamic, that it's changing the whole time. So it means that we as teachers can actually work with learners, and if they are experiencing a motivational problem, then we can actually help them with it and address it. So that's what I want to focus on for the rest of the session, and I'm going to use my categories of individual, curriculum, real time as a way of looking at how we can actually work on learners' motivation. So starting with individual motivation, so how can we do this? So one of the ways is we can set goals. So we can have tutorials with learners, or we could do this with written email, or you might have a learning management system where you can communicate with your learners. So actually goal setting is important. We're going to look a little bit in a few minutes. We're going to look at a specific idea of what I mean by goal. It's also helpful if we get learners to reflect on their individual needs. So getting them to think about what they need to do, rather than just the teacher telling them the whole time. This is where we can actually look at getting learners to imagine their future selves. So doing activities in classes where they imagine what kind of English language speaker they hope to become, even if they're only at, say, B1 level. You know, when it's interesting for them to dream about the kind of learner, or the kind of speaker they might be in a year's time or 2 or 3 years' time. Also, I think it's useful if we find out about learners' ought to selves. So often this will come through needs analysis or tutorials or written e-communication. So often we can't, if there is some kind of external pressure, often we can't change that. But I think as teachers it's useful if we know about it. So if we know that there is some kind of external pressure that the learner is having to deal with, that might affect our decision making in terms of the sorts of things that we might ask that learner to do. Then finally, we can also look at the thing of providing manageable activities for learners, the kinds of things that are going to give them confidence. So, a degree of challenge, but a sense that they are actually achieving something. So here's a small task. What I would like you to do is match the learner comment to the teacher response. So this is looking at individual motivation. So 1, 2, 3 is something that a learner might say, and ABC is the teacher's response. So see if you can match those together and type your answers into the chat box. Okay, great. Some answers coming through. Great. Yes, most of you seem to have the same answers, which I would agree with. I'll just leave it up so most people have got an opportunity to contribute. Great. So I want to speak very, very good English like a native speaker. I think in terms of a goal that's quite challenging. So I think, yes, the teacher's response is going to be C, because at A2 level, it's going to take a while for that learner to actually be able to achieve that goal. So often I see goals as something more tangible, something that's more manageable. We'll have a look at that in a moment. And number 2, yes, my future self passes the grammar test next month. That's actually, the whole idea of the future self is that it's aspirational. It's a kind of a dream, and passing a grammar test maybe is not a very exciting dream. And in effect, 1 and 2, we want students to be doing both. Is on one level, we want them to have manageable, achievable goals, but on the other level, we also perhaps want them to have some kind of dream. So getting learners to understand that distinction, I think, is useful, and the teacher response does that. Then number 3, obviously, yes, is B. The role play was easy, yes, but you made quite a few mistakes. So yes. What we need to do here, I think, is make sure that learners' goals are realistic and achievable. So this is what I would say to the learner, that, okay, it's good to have that dream of wanting to be like a native speaker, but in the meantime, if you're able just to talk about yourself, then, in a simple way, so that you can say who you are, the things that you like doing, your interests, your hobbies, etc., talk about your family, then that is perhaps more manageable at A2 level. And again, this idea of the future self is about imagining the kind of thing that you might want to do. And learners may need help in terms of how they do this kind of visualization. There's a very good book written by Zoltan Dornier and Jill Hadfield, in which they have a range of exercises in which they can help, in which suggest how you can help learners to imagine their future selves. So this is one of their things. This is one of their tasks, where learners actually close their eyes and they imagine what kind of future self they have in mind. Is it to do with work or study, friends or travel? Now imagine yourself in the situation. Where are you? So it's kind of, learners are talked through by the teacher the actual sort of reality of that situation, and the idea is it becomes vivid for the learner. And then obviously, after learners have done this kind of visualization, they can then work in pairs or small groups and actually report back to each other, and that is a very nice way of providing some spoken fluency practice. Then the role play was easy, but maybe a bit boring. So, obviously we do need to be aware of how challenging activities are, whether they're too easy or whether they're too difficult. At the same time, we also do need to remind learners, because sometimes learners will do an activity very, very, very quickly, and then I go and look at what they've done, and they've, out of 8 questions, they've got 6 that are wrong, and they actually haven't thought about it carefully enough. And sometimes we can intervene and provide a degree of challenge. Okay, so what I'd like to move on to now is the curriculum side of motivation. So looking at the kinds of issues that can arise there in terms of the materials that we provide our learners in the classroom and the kind of course that they are following, because often these will play a strong role in how learners feel about turning up to class. So what I'm going to do is, the next task involves showing you 4 different bits of material that I think are in some way problematic. And what I would suggest you do is just write in the chat box what you think might be problematic about these. So this is the first piece of material. So in effect, what you would give to your learners would look pretty much like what you've got on screen at the moment. They have a speaking activity that is a lead-in, where they talk about Buenos Aires and what they know about Buenos Aires and Argentina. And then the next part on the worksheet would be this reading text, which talks about Buenos Aires being the city of music. What I've included here are just the first 2 paragraphs of a reading text that which continues and goes on, is a little bit longer. So in effect, this is what learners would be handed in the classroom, something that looks like this. A worksheet of some kind, a handout, a piece of paper with the speaking and the reading text on the paper. So what might be problematic about this activity looking like that? Okay, a few ideas coming through. Good, yeah, so a lot of you are looking at the idea of background knowledge, which I think is really interesting. So it is associated with that, and there's something more specific which I'll show you in a moment. Okay. Now, some really good ideas coming through. That's great. Okay, so let's move on to the next piece of material. So this again is a reading text, and the aim of this reading text is to provide examples of the present perfect, of the present simple, to talk about daily routines. So it's about farming in India. So farmers in India work very hard. Farming families live together and work in the fields every day. Many farmers get up at 4 a.m. They work in the fields from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. At 9 p.m. they always stop. 9 a.m. they always stop for breakfast, etc. So it's giving an example of daily routine. So this would be a context for the present simple used to talk about daily routines. Okay, yes, some interesting ideas coming through here to do with familiarity, interest, etc. Okay, difficult to connect to their own life, etc. Good, okay, some really good answers. So let's look at the next bit of material. So in this piece of material, learners listen to a dialogue. The dialogue is here, and the aim of this material is to focus on the present perfect. So what learners do is they listen to the dialogue, which has examples of the present perfect in it, and then they move from that to practicing the present perfect, where they listen and repeat examples. So they move from the listening to the grammar, where they listen and repeat to the grammar. Okay, people are typing, so I'll just pause for a moment. Good. Yeah. So people are coming. Yeah, great answers to do with the level of interest, the fact that it's just drilling, the confusion that it could cause, and yeah, no context, boring. I would agree with that. Okay. Good. And then the final piece of material. This is a practice activity, so exercise 4, this is again for A2 level, and it's to do with routines, weekend routines. So they do a dialogue where they actually have to order. That's a kind of a control practice. And the problem here is with task 5. So what's problematic about the speaking task? Say examples about people, use the present simple. So the problem here is with activity 5. Okay, yes, thank you. I think task 4 does what someone said, that task 4 works quite well, and I think it probably does as a controlled practice activity. But again, as I said, the problem is with 5. Yes, people are saying not very personalized, vague, absence of context. That's great. You're a wonderful group. You've come through fantastic answers on all these bits of materials, and I pretty much agree with what you're saying. And these, I think, are all issues that can affect learners' motivation. So these are the 4 that we've looked at: the text on Buenos Aires, the reading on India, the listening and grammar for the present perfect, and the speaking activity. So, in effect, with Buenos Aires, a lot of you acknowledged the fact that there wasn't much background information or knowledge, and also it was a little bit boring. And so what the key thing I think here for this particular text is if you actually provide some visual material, it will engage learners, and it actually provides a little bit of context and a little bit of background information. They can actually see what's going on. They can see people dancing tango, and the whole thing becomes more alive and actually fills out a lot of background. Without that, it's a little bit dry and abstract. Likewise with the Indian text. Now, here is this text rewritten in a slightly different way, where it's actually focusing on a specific family. And I think that it's a very, very simple change, but the fact that you've actually got a family and you're talking about specific people, and you can also see there are photos, etc., I think that moves it away from being a sort of a dry academic text and means that it's a little bit more interesting. So this idea of introducing a human interest element into the text that we provide, and it doesn't have to be a dramatic thing, it's just so that learners can see this is not just about abstract Indian farmers, but it's about people getting on with their lives, a family, an individual family, and these are their names, these are who they are. And as a lot of you also were able to perceive, the grammar there, the grammar, focusing on the grammar, just getting students to listen and repeat examples of the present perfect is not very motivating. So here, if we look at exercise B, we can see there are questions that actually focus on how the present perfect is used and what the actual meaning is. Getting students to repeat that language if you actually haven't dealt with the meaning in some way, so that they actually understand what they are saying, then it gets to be problematic. Okay, and then the final one, the final activity is, yes, it was all a little bit abstract, whereas it's much more interesting if you can get learners to talk about people that they actually know. Not just about random people, but about their family, about their friends, their classmates, etc. So this idea that you personalize language to some degree. So this is what I think we need to do in terms of curriculum motivation. So we want striking visuals, we want material with good visuals, we want text with topics that are of interest to learners, we want to sequence activities in a logical manner so that you don't just go from examples to drilling, that you actually have a step in your learning sequence where you deal with meaning, which actually will support learners through the learning cycle. And then in the end, you want to provide them with opportunities to personalize new language. Okay, so we're running a little bit short of time, not short of time, but time is marching on. So I'm just going to go straight to the answers with this particular task. So what we're looking at now is real-time motivation and the sorts of issues that can arise. So we'll just talk through these scenarios. So the first one is a teacher saying, okay, a role play, student A, you're a pilot, student B, you're the captain of a ship, talk about your job, start talking now. And the net result of this, obviously, is silence. Now, sometimes when I've been observing teachers, I've seen them do, if not exactly this, something like this, where we're kind of throwing them into context or scenarios or getting them to do activities without actually giving them sufficient preparation. So here, the student A needs to think about what a pilot actually does, and then student B needs to think about the kind of jobs that a captain of a ship might do. So they've got to think of the ideas first, and then they've got to actually think of the language in which they can express these ideas. So they're going to need some preparation time. So I think this is an example where a teacher is kind of rushing into an activity and not giving the learners enough space and enough thinking time. And as someone has mentioned here, some kind of brainstorming to actually get them underway. So this here is where we as a teacher have an important part to play, where we need to set up activities clearly and give students time to prepare. The second one is, tell your friend Diego about the music you like. Silence. What's the problem? Why aren't you talking? And the student answers, I know the music he likes. So the problem for the student is, of course, that it seems ridiculous to be actually talking about something that they know the answer to already. There, in fact, is no information gap here. And what that means for us is, in order to avoid this situation, it means that we need to get to know our learners and think about classroom management carefully when we're preparing our lessons. So how are we going to put students in pairs and groups? And if it's an activity that is associated with personalized information to some degree, if students know each other, we have to think of perhaps a way in which they don't. We might need to give them a different role or think about pairing them with a different student. So this is something that we do have control over. And here you've got a student sort of saying, I'm not sure, can I use the present perfect or past simple? And the teacher says, don't worry too much, I understand what you're saying. So I think that something like this, and again, I've seen teachers when I've observed lessons sometimes say things, if not exactly like this, but similar to this. And I think that the student feels that they're not being listened to, and that they have a question, they have a need, and they feel that that need is not being addressed in the lesson. So I think that what we can do here is make sure that we, first of all, monitor attentively in lessons, and we actually respond to learners' needs as they arrive, and not just sort of say, oh, don't worry about that, it's not important. For that learner, it is important, so we need to take it seriously. And I think if we don't take it seriously, that can have a negative effect on motivation. So to sum up here, what I would say is that in terms of managing real-time motivation, we need to make sure that we set up activities clearly and give students time to think about what they're going to do, what they're going to say. We need to think carefully about classroom management at the time when we are planning the lesson often. We need to think about that in advance. We need to monitor attentively and deal with the kind of questions that learners have as they come up in the lesson. And that might be about information and it might be about language. The other thing that we didn't cover in the scenarios is the idea that occasionally we might need to vary our teaching skills. So sometimes we will question learners a lot, but sometimes we might need to explain and think about how we balance the degree of explanation that we give with the degree of questioning that we do. We might need to change that from time to time. Another example is, do you correct an error on the spot, or do you give delayed feedback? So you might like to might to vary that as well. Sometimes correct on the spot, sometimes wait and give delayed feedback. It will obviously depend on the activity. So a lot of these things are to do with our teaching skills, I think. And I think that these do have a role to play in motivation, and perhaps we need to adjust those from time to time in order to help our learners. That could be part of the problem. So we've more or less got to the end. So let's just sum up some of the key points that I've made here in terms of motivation. So the ideas, the kind of concepts that I was exploring, I looked at the history, and then I came up with these three kind of categories that work for me. And as I said, they may not work for you, but if not, they may trigger something. So some of the motivation, I think, is associated with the learner as an individual. Some of it is associated with the curriculum that she is following, and some is associated with motivation as it unfolds in the lesson in real time. So these are the categories that I've found useful in terms of thinking about motivation and then trying to work out what the problem is. So if I think there's a problem with motivation, so is it something to do with the individual learner? Is it something to do with the curriculum that we're following, the materials, the tests, something along those lines? Or is it something that I'm actually doing in the lesson on a daily basis which is not working? Okay, so the key point is that all of these, I think, are dynamic processes that change over time. Individual motivation changes over time. Curriculum motivation can change over time because we can be the agents of change. And then obviously we've got a lot of control over what happens in the lesson. And also what this suggests is that learners will change in terms of their motivation during the course of following a curriculum and then during the course of an individual lesson. Particularly, I used to teach in Rome, and I always remember we had a lesson that went from 6:30 to 8:30 on a Friday night, and students, they were very motivated. They're a fantastic group, but obviously when it was at about 8 o'clock, their motivation was flagging, and that was just because they were tired. Okay, and what I needed to do obviously was provide a fun game for them at that stage, which is usually how we ended the week, and that helped enormously. So I think in terms of individual motivation, it helps if we maintain some kind of dialogue. So we need to talk to our learners the whole time and find out what's going on for them, how their motivation is changing. Okay, and we can provide them with the kinds of activities like the motivational self-activity, where they can explore motivation and find out what it means to be an English language learner. So curriculum motivation, I think the key area where we can intervene here really is we may not be able to change the syllabus because that could be determined by the institution, but I think the materials that we take into the classroom and the way in which we enhance them. So even if you have got a course book that doesn't have interesting visual material, you can actually easily find visual material online and print out pictures, and that can help enormously. And then finally, real-time motivation, and this is where we need to use a good range of our own teaching skills and be very tuned into learners during the course of a lesson and be aware of what's happening for them and adjust accordingly. Okay, so that is the end of the webinar, and I believe that we have got some time left for questions.
We have indeed, Craig. Thank you very much for that. So I'll try to fit in as many of these as possible. We had a few people asking about whether you have any particular advice on motivating students in either mixed ability groups or in different age groups.
Yeah, I think mixed ability groups can be quite quite tricky. I'm actually teaching one at the moment. So I've got a class which is kind of a mix of advanced and upper intermediate learners. So that's quite tricky. So often it requires you to actually be thinking the whole time of what you're going to do with the stronger learners in a group, and often it's necessary to maybe look a little bit ahead in the course book and think, okay, if they finish that, as you're monitoring and moving around the classroom, just say, okay, you finished that, now go on to this. Or you might actually take in some extra materials with you into the classroom and hand those out. Often, I think it pays with a mixed ability class to actually vary the interaction quite a bit and think about what you're getting students to do. Now, sometimes there are some activities where having a stronger and a weaker learner will work really well, but other activities, I think it's better to actually put all the strong learners together and all the weaker learners together. So I think that managing the interaction is another kind of key component there. In effect, I don't think there's any one-size-fits-all answer to mixed ability classes, because the other dimension to this, obviously, the personalities of the students, and some students are quite relaxed about being in a mixed ability classes, where others feel far more anxious or uncomfortable or aggrieved in some way. So it really does depend on the individual learner group that you're working with. But I think that providing extra activities for stronger learners can help enormously. Also challenging them, sort of correcting them maybe a little bit more and giving them a sense of challenge, but also at the same time think very carefully about how you group and move students around a lot. Those would be my sort of two main suggestions, and ones that I'm actually implementing at the moment on a daily basis.
Great, thanks. Question from James Halal, who talked about running classes that go on from 8:30 in the morning till 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 3 days a week. And he's having problems with the sort of after lunch period where students are beginning to drop off a little. Do you have any particular suggestions for motivating them at that time of day? Anything to keep the interest going?
Yes, that's a scenario I know very well, because in New Zealand we have classes that last all day as well. So I'm very, very familiar with the after lunch kind of sag, as it were, where students... so again, there's no kind of easy answer to do this. To this, students are tired, so we just, to some degree, you just have to accept the fact that they will be tired. It requires extra energy from us, the teacher. But what I would suggest is, where possible, if at all possible, to try and find as many active activities as you can. So, I mean, for example, after lunch, I wouldn't do a long listening where learners are sort of in danger perhaps of falling asleep. Something that's very interactive, something that gets students moving around, things like mingle activities that get students up and actually moving around the classroom, if that's possible in the space that you are teaching in. And the other thing is, perhaps you need to think in terms of having a series of shorter, smaller activities, so there is more of a change of focus in the afternoon. So, sort of longer activities where they're sort of dealing with kind of more complex grammar issues or difficult vocabulary, and it's an activity that takes a great deal of thought, is perhaps going to be less successful. So I think really it's a case of curriculum motivation more than anything else, but it does require the teacher to kind of, you've got to be the motivator, and it does actually take more physical energy on our behalf to teach those afternoon classes.
Okay, thanks. Having a few questions about sort of extremes, actually. People asking about teaching individuals and keeping motivation up there, and others asking about teaching when you have sort of 40 to 50 students in the classroom. I don't know which of those people prefer to answer.
Well, maybe the individuals, I think, is perhaps easier for me. I mean, I haven't, to be honest, I don't have a lot of experience of teaching very large groups of 50 students, but certainly with individuals, I think that's where a lot of the issues that I looked at in terms of individual motivation, in terms of goal setting and actually having appropriate goals on a sort of a daily, weekly basis is really, really important, so that you give a learner a sense of where they are going and they're actually achieving something. And that actually is quite, that can be quite easy to manage, because you can actually maintain that sort of motivational dialogue with the learners very, very, very easily. The other thing there is a little bit like the after lunch thing, when you're working with a one-to-one learner, I think you do need to change focus quite often. So you do need to plan quite carefully what you're going to do with learners. And I think probably the same actually goes with large groups. I mean, the secret probably with a larger group is to actually think of activities that are sort of activities that they're going to like, and planning a series of those as much as you possibly can within the confines of any syllabus or curriculum that you're having to follow. I appreciate that with a larger group that being able to actually check into individual motivation is far more problematic. And I think when I talked about having a dialogue with your students, obviously doing tutorials with 50 individual students is perhaps going to be tricky. So this is where electronic communication perhaps can actually help us significantly, because we can perhaps do a little bit of this by email, or having maybe actually opening a class Facebook page or something along those lines, where you can actually address some of these more individual motivational issues. So I don't know how well I've answered that question, but I hope these ideas might be of some use, or might trigger something else for you.
Okay, well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. But thank you so much, Craig, for an absolutely fascinating session with an excellent attendance. So thank you also everyone who's attended. Don't forget that this is only the first. Pardon me. This is only the first in our series of webinars for 2016. There are already 10 webinars listed on our events page, and more will be announced soon. There's no webinar next week, but in 2 weeks' time, on February the 2nd, at the usual time of 3 p.m. in the UK, we'll be joined by Ben Goldstein, who'll be looking at types of online video and sharing some exciting video projects you can use with your learners. The week after that, on February the 9th, Anne Robinson will be talking about teaching young learners the important skill of paraphrasing. And then on Thursday the 11th, at 8:30 p.m. in the UK, Jean Lambert will be discussing how to teach your students about plagiarism. You can sign up for all those sessions by visiting our events page, and we'll post a link for that in the chat. In fact, Sarah just has. And if you want to read a bit more about the webinars, if you go to our blog, I'll post a link in the chat for that. But we've posted an article in the blog talking about all the webinars that we've got coming up in 2016 so far. And there will be more announced in the next week or so. So it's worth coming back and checking again. Just posted that link in the chat. So the recording of today's webinar should be live on our blog and on our YouTube channel from Friday, and we'll send you a certificate of attendance by Monday. So thank you very much everyone for attending. Thank you to my colleagues Laura and Sarah for their excellent work in the chat. And most of all, thank you to you, Craig, for an absolutely fascinating, really interesting session. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Alistair, and thank you everyone for attending. And thank you for your participation. It's been great.